Hello, in this video, I want to continue to talk about some of the stuff that we've been discussing in terms of racial capitalism on the intellectual property protections resolution. As I kind of said in the last video, I think that racial capitalism on this particular resolution for the September and October slate for the Lincoln Douglas event, I think is particularly really important because I think that racial capitalism has a really interesting way of framing, especially affirmative arguments against a lot of the possible slate of negative arguments you can usually see in LD, and I think that it responds to all of the arguments that you can commonly see on the topic, whether it be topic-based disads and counterplans or specific criticisms or framework arguments. I think all of which have really good responses that are endemic to like what racial capitalism is trying to say about the intellectual property protections resolution as a whole. And so I think that it's a very good kind of like place for us to continue the conversation where I first introduced this and kind of talked a little bit about the way that I think it operates versus like various types of case strategies and what I think like the best kind of framing for this affirmative kind of is against case strategies and framework strategies. And so if you haven't, I would definitely say go look at that video because I think that it's very helpful to have a better understanding of a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about and exploring in this particular video. And I think just in general, having a kind of continuance of my thoughts can allow you to get, I think, a much better holistic understanding of like the way that I'm speaking through topics like racial capitalism instead of just these kind of like snippets and smaller videos that I think can sometimes not really give the entire kind of structure for what I really want to talk about and are really ways of me like talking about specific instances and contexts where I think these arguments are useful and like good. And so to kind of continue with some of the conversation that we had from the last video, I really want to expand how we're thinking about the strengths of racial capitalism affirmatives against like various types of criticisms. I think that racial capitalism is extremely good against a lot of criticisms because I feel like a lot of times when people normatively read affirmatives about capitalism against various critiques, every team I feel like is able to pull out their stock like Marx bad or like sole capitalist theory or capitalist theorizing on its own bad kind of like link arguments and stuff like that. And I think that a lot of times that there's such a like diverse history to grasp from in terms of how various types of vertical movements have kind of like organized themselves, that there's a lot of like ways in which teams can find various unique indites of Marxist theories in the way that it's not only thinking about like praxis but also its fundamental theories of time, the labor theory of value, etc. And I think that racial capitalism definitely throws a curveball at a lot of these like generic like arguments that most criticisms want to make against the CapK as a whole. As I've talked about in like some other conversations I've had about racial capitalism, if they like are already up on the channel, I've always kind of talked about how I think the specific way that racial capitalism not as something that just talks about race, but rather as a specific theory of the way in which like slavery, native genocide, and the accumulation of violence creates like forms of creates like a framing that changes the way that we think about how Marxism shows up as a theory and as a practice that I think kind of shields against a lot of the normative arguments that people want to make against the CapK. And the reason is because when you're kind of like changing how you think about like the look of what the worker is or like what the role of the worker is in larger capitalist organizing, because of the way that racial capitalism specifically thinks about the role that the lumper proletariat and that slavery and genocide plays in the particular remaking of how we think about the worker as a subject, like requires us to then change the way that the other teams are also organizing their link arguments. And I think the better that you're at explaining racial capitalism as a theory that's really distinct from normative Marxism, the higher the standard raises for how other teams have to describe their link arguments and how they have to get around the way in which you're really like resolving some of the complexities that come from the way in which people normatively challenge Marx. I also think that racial capitalism is really strong against a lot of criticisms because of the way that it can have really strong framing arguments about the unique role that debate plays in terms of its ability to allow us to test tactics regardless of whether or not they transition to the outside. There's so many good arguments about like how taking up various types of spaces in order to produce anti-capitalism is kind of necessary for breaking through the various places in which like capitalism like creates holes or like places for resistance. And I think that there are so many good arguments about why classrooms and the remaking and changing of the way in which classrooms operate in order to be oriented to talking about how these various forms of violence create and accumulate into these more larger scale series of violence is a really interesting place where racial capitalism is able to push a lot of both procedural arguments in terms of like why using example based debating and the praxis based debating kind of creates the best standard for how we define things like competition, but also the way in which we're kind of thinking about how criticisms are how we're able to use like the value of like the income and crisis of capitalism, the uniqueness argument, and that's in like every capitalist anti-capitalist affirmative. It comes across in a racial capitalism argument to make sense of how the way in which we kind of relate to each other, the way that we're able to think of strategy and praxis on an everyday basis changes the way in which we're able to respond to capitalism as a crisis outside of us, whether it be climate change that we see every day in our face or various other just situations or moments in which we are supposed to be choosing things like mutual aid and mutual development instead of the way in which we kind of think about very individualistic notions of like pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps bootstrap, becoming like this revolutionary or capitalist subject, and then kind of like going on about your day. And I think that racial capitalism has a really good job building depth and texture into those types of arguments that makes it really strong, which then allows you to set up a lot of ways that you can kind of like make the debate almost feel closer to a counterplan debate, or make it a lot easier for you to win the permutation, because it forces things like the criticism's alternative to have a specific kind of like plight with the affirmative, that it can then have a specific set of examples to work off of that differentiate from the affirmative, which I think is often hard with the way that racial capitalism is really reconsidering methodology and changing the role in the way we think about like the centering of vertical movement organizing and the way that we like create praxis. I think that when you kind of transition a lot of this onto how you're thinking about the counterplan dissat debate on the intellectual property protections topic, I think a lot of the arguments that will be made against racial capitalism will mostly be impact term based debating. I feel like a lot of the ways that people will try to debate these affirmatives will be about the way in which they can prove that the removal or the abolishing, which is what I think racial capitalism kind of really seeks towards, of intellectual property protections as like a field or as like a set of laws that like are committed to various forms of dispossession and violence. And I think there are a lot of counterplan and dissat arguments to be made about like the various ways in which that creates the condition for, you know, economic downfall, why that creates and causes and spurs various types of war, small scale and large, and why that spills over, especially on something that centers around the WTO, to various types of global markets. And I feel like all the arguments that racial capitalism can make to combat a lot of this stuff is using the arguments about racial dispossession and the specific arguments about how it creates a specific type of marginalization that creates and continues to justify killing of various populations as something that is being used as a framing for why there's a kind of like more than just like a numbers impact to like the capitalism argument versus the dissat or the counterplan, but rather a question of the types of ethics that we commit to ourselves to, and why those things can even be more important than humanity's survival, because humanity's survival is inevitably in danger in the way that we like relate to the world, if it's through capitalism, if it's through a colonial developmentalist lens. And I think a lot of what racial capitalism asks on the intellectual properties protection topic sets you up to have like a really strong criticism of the way in which the sustaining of like lawfare programs like intellectual property protections make it impossible for marginalized communities to be able to like stand on their own and defend themselves, because of the way not only is the international grid already locked in by like your ability to own a sovereign state, i.e. there are marginalized populations that have no sovereign state, i.e. for instance black people in America, etc., that don't get access to the WTO, native tribes, etc. And I think that that in combination with the way in which the structuring of intellectual property protections as a whole kind of creates and perpetuates like Western myths about who controls and centers knowledge, you have a lot of reasons why the counterplan and the dissat isn't actually sustainable for like keeping populations not only livable, but as places where communities can find agency and create moments of resistance. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll find the next couple videos, the last couple videos I'll be doing talking about racial capitalism on the intellectual property protections topic helpful. Yeah, thanks for tuning in.